Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Over the years, we've had guests from a variety of traditions, and often one of the traditions that so many of you like to hear about are those that come into Christianity from Judaism. And such as our guest tonight, Dan Teller, is a convert from Judaism. He's also the founder and catechist of Good Shepherd Catholic Montessori, and we'll talk about that later, I assume, and he's also the trustee of the Angelical Project, but I'm not sure what that is. We'll find out again in the second half of the program. But Dan, welcome to The Journey Home.
Thank you, Marcus. Nice to be here with you.
It's great to have you here. Look forward to hear your story. Fortunately, you drove up from Cincinnati, and beautiful time of the year,
Yeah.
right? The greening of Ohio is a beautiful
Glorious.
time of the year. It is. So, as I normally do in the program, our goal is to encourage you to take us all the way back to the beginning of your own journey and give us a snippet of how the Lord brought you into the church.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm happy to do that. As you said, I grew up in a Jewish home. My father's parents were from Eastern Europe and from Russia and were Orthodox Jews.
Okay.
But the home I grew up in was a Reformed Jewish home.
I don't think our audience, because I can always forget.
Okay.
There's Orthodox and
Orthodox,
Reformed.
Conservative, and Reform are the three, you might say, branches of Judaism. Reformed Judaism actually developed in Cincinnati with the Rabbi Isaac Wise,
Really?
which was my temple growing up, the Wise Temple. And Reformed Judaism was a way to sort of adapt the practice of Judaism to American culture. It wasn't a strict observance, as an Orthodox would observe many of the laws much more strictly. Okay. Conservatism falls in between Reform and Orthodoxy. In an Orthodox synagogue, the men and women would be still separate in their worship, one sitting on either sides of the temple. When we were first married, we lived in a neighborhood where we would see every Saturday morning people walking to temple. That was the Orthodox, who would still observe their Sabbath rest in that way by not driving or even turning on their ovens. But I grew up in a Reformed home.
Well, this might seem like a funny question to ask, but did Reformed Jews believe in God?
Yes. I grew up believing in God.
Okay.
I grew up not questioning God's existence. As a child, I remember wondering about God's omnipotence, His omniscience, and omnipresence. Those three things really captivated me, and I thought about it. How could that be? So I did believe in God. I don't know that we, as a child growing up in a Reformed Jewish home, had a strong relationship, though.
Yeah.
It was just sort of something that was present, but not. We weren't a family of prayer. We were a family of practice, you might say, the practice of Judaism.
I asked that because it may have sounded like a rude question, but sadly, I've encountered an awful lot of Jews that think of themselves as Jews and maybe even celebrate the seasons, but when comes to shove, it's like the vertical doesn't exist anymore.
That's very true. As you said, I worked at a Montessori school. I would take children to a Jewish synagogue each year, some of the older children I taught, because we were studying the history of Judaism, and I brought them to the rabbi, and it was a Reform synagogue, and the rabbi started by saying to the children, what is a Jew? Is a Jew a believer? Is a Jew a member of a people? Is a Jew a member of a culture? And you can answer that in any of those ways. Yeah. That's how the rabbi informed us. So there's no real, firm. To be a Catholic means I'm a member of this church. I believe in this set of beliefs, and I hopefully have this set of practices. Yeah. But I think it's very different for Judaism.
Yeah. Wow. Being brought up in a Jewish home, practicing Reformed Jewish home, what was your view as a young person of Christianity and even the Catholic Church?
That's a good question. It was very removed. I think that there is a subtle sense growing up of Jesus is not some place where I go. I don't think about that. I don't talk about that. And somehow subtly it seeped into me that that's something to stay away from. I know that growing up, that in St. Paul's letters, the words Jesus and Christ were on every page. And that's not something I open to look at. That was sort of the sense I had about it. At the same time, I, as a child growing up wondered a lot about this. I can remember as a child, my parents would take us on rides at Christmas to look at the Christmas lights. And on Christmas Eve, we must have done this on Christmas Eve sometimes, and I was thinking, in all those homes, something really special is happening. What could it be? It's really quiet. There's something mystical going on, and I'm not quite sure what it is. So I was sort of wondering about that too.
So that you're brought up in an active Jewish home, but when active, but no prayer at home. And
we celebrated Shabbat. We always had Shabbat meals, lit the candles, the blessing over the candles, the bread and the wine. We always went to temple on high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We fasted. On Yom Kippur, we would celebrate Seder and Passover. Always had a Passover meal with my family. I went to religious school every week. I was bar mitzvahed, learned Hebrew well enough to read from the Torah. So my mother would create a sukkah every fall, which is the Feast of Booths, where the Jewish people would live out in the fields for a week during the harvest. Well, now you create sukkahs, which are booths with dried corn and gourds and pumpkins and things to celebrate the harvest festival. So we did all those things. The one thing we didn't do is pray together. And one thing that happened to me when I left for college, I went to another city for college, and it was September, and it was the high holidays came around, and I said, I'm going to go to temple. And I went there, and my overwhelming feeling was loneliness. I didn't feel connected to the celebration that was happening, to the prayers. I felt like I'm not in my community, my family. That was my community growing up. And so I realized that my Jewish root was a family connection, it wasn't a spiritual connection. There was nothing to keep me once I left that home of my family in my practice of Judaism. I never thought of myself as not being Jewish anymore. I just had no reason to practice it unless I was around my family.
Dan, it fascinates me when I think about when you read the Old Testament, you read the Psalms, and you find all those places where Jewish parents are instructed to tell your children about the history, right?
Yes.
Think about all those places. They go and then they recite the whole story. Psalm 78 jumps out at me where he goes through this whole story and talks about often not just what Israel went through and what God did for them, but one of the reasons God did that is they kept sinning. They kept messing up. And so the underlying reason to repeat these stories is so we help our kids not do what they did so they can stay faithful to God. So it's interesting that you can tell the stories, but forget that part of it.
Well, I think that has to come from the heart, doesn't it?
Yeah. I'm not being critical of your parents. But we ourselves, Christians, the same thing. Why do we tell our kids about our faith and about what happened? Is so that they don't make the mistakes we made and they make, so they can live faithfully with God.
After I was grown and I started having children and had entered the church, my parents became much more practiced and more observant of their own Judaism. They went to Bible study. They did more prayerful and study events. And I think they regretted not doing that while they were raising me for that reason. I think they felt like they hadn't captured the heart.
Yeah, well, in fact, that's also important, Dan, that you emphasize the heart, because that really is the key throughout the Old Testament. That's what's going on in here.
Yeah, because I knew the story, like you're saying. It's told every year at the Passover story is told every year at Exodus. And I knew all the stories of, many of the stories of the Jewish people. Not all of them, but a lot of them I knew. Okay.
Our guest is Dan Teller. So you're brought up in this Jewish home. You have a belief in God, right?
Yes.
But as you said, not a deep personal conviction, if you will, right?
No, it's just something that's there. It's sort of somewhat nebulous.
All right. Well, let's take us on from there, how that develops.
Well, when I was in high school, I started taking walks with my dog, and there was a nice big patch of woods not far from my house. And I started spending time in silence in this woods and was very attracted to that. And I feel like that was sort of the beginning of sort of like a stirring of a mystical desire, a yearning for God. I didn't know that but it was really captivating to me. And it was an experience of peace and of wonder in the woods that I wanted to continue to recapture. So I did that regularly. Went for walks in the woods. Throughout my college years, I was really drawn towards nature. Spent a lot of time by myself in nature with friends. Read Thoreau. Was really and I think that was my search for something true and good and beautiful in the natural world. After college, I got a job as a naturalist. And my second position as a naturalist was at a rural center in Ohio for kids that would come out for a week, and we would lead them. And we lived on site on a 400-acre center, and I had a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time in solitude to myself. And at that time, a young woman that I knew came to visit me and brought a book for me to read about Zen Buddhism. So this is sort of like the next part of my journey is journeying into Buddhism. Shall I carry on with that?
Yes, please do.
So I read this book, and I was someone that was very eager for finding truth without knowing it. That's what led me into nature. It led me to Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, the American writers like Emerson and Thoreau. When I read this book on Zen Buddhism and read about the mystical experience that it was describing, I just said, that's what I want. I want to have something that's beyond this world, something that is transcendent and permanent, we might say. And I just, on my own, just started practicing what the book explained, how to meditate, how to do walking meditation. I did it, you might say, religiously on my own, in my own room every day. And at the end of that year, I decided I need to pursue this practice of Zen Buddhism, and I'm going to look into it. And so I did some research and found out there's various Zen centers all around our country, and I found one that I would go to. And so that was my next step. I journeyed out to California to a place called Mount Baldy Zen Center in Southern California in the mountains outside of Los Angeles, appeared there, and was ready to become a Zen student. And there at Mount Baldy, we lived what you might call a monastic life. We rose at 3 a.m., we chanted, we meditated, we had breakfast, we worked all day doing physical labor, meditated again in the evening, and went to bed. And I did that every day. Once a month, there was retreats where we meditated for a week in silence with breaks. And we had a Zen master there whose name was Joshu Sasaki Roshi. He was from Japan. And he was very compelling to me, and the practice was very compelling. And I felt like I was on a search for something good, and I was surrounded by other people doing that same thing, looking for what is taking away from the world, going away from the world and looking for something that's enduring and true. Obviously, now I know that that wasn't the path to my answer, but it was what I was doing at that time.
But on the one hand, there's a reasonableness to it if you accept the reality that God created everyone with this desire. And so that's why we see religions all over throughout histories coming up in different cultures, because within the hearts of those people is a desire to know the Creator.
Yes.
So that we recognize the foundation for that. I mean, we believe that. But that's also why God gave us revelation, so eventually we can make sure we get it correct.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're off on your own. So your desire makes sense to me. You were brought up in a Jewish home without that intimacy, a desire for searching that. But on the other hand, what was the concept of God in that Zen experience?
I'm going to give you my understanding of that, and it may not coincide with how other people understand Zen or even scholars. There is no concept of God as a personal being. That was my understanding. That Zen is seeking an experience of oneness with the reality of a world that constantly changes. That's how I understood it. And that our suffering comes when we remove ourselves from the continual flow of life, whether it's flowing through things that are good or bad. But when you separate yourself in opposition to that, then we suffer and don't enter into the true reality of the continual flux and change of life. We separate ourselves. We had something called koans, which were riddles that really can't be answered rationally, that were intended to sort of disrupt your rational thinking and I think orient you to a new way of viewing things. So the Zen master, Roshi's, the first koan he would give us is you'd walk in, you'd sit before him, and there would be a block of wood, and he'd strike it. And he said, "Who are you when you hear that sound?" He'd give you that question. And how do you answer that, right? His teaching was that the moment you hear that, you've dissolved into that sound for a split second. And then you emerge from that, and you're back into the next flow of the stream of reality. Your task is to make yourself harmonious with that flow and not separate. And I think the dissolving of the ego and the ability to do that is sort of replaces the idea of God. Yeah. It's sort of a state of being, but not an ultimate truth of a person or a being that we can refer to. That was my understanding.
So God places within us a hunger for him, right? So we have these other groups that are trying to satisfy that hunger,
yes,
but with other options.
I think everything is trying to satisfy a fundamental hunger. Yeah. That's why people are doing something so radical. You know, so there's a goodness to their attempts, and their desire in itself is a good thing. We just didn't have the right goal in mind that we could seek.
Yeah, which I've always seen as the foundation for our missionary work to groups like that, because we're building them. We know that there's a seed in there that they want to find.
Yeah.
It's just how do we cut through that to get them to hear the truth about the God that created them.
Well, it's as St. Augustine would say, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord, because the restlessness is that yearning for hopefully that people have. Unfortunately, today many people have masked that.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to think about the parallels with that experience you were having with monastic life in the Catholic Church. You know, it's almost exactly step by step Catholic monasticism.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, but just not very vertical.
No, not at all.
To God, it's just here, you know, or here, inward. Right.
Yes.
So how long were you involved with that?
18 months.
Okay.
I lived 18 months at the Zen Center. It was very rigorous in my practice, and decided to come home and discern whether to go back and be a monk or to leave and hopefully get married and raise a family. That was my moment of discernment. And remember deciding I'll stay home and I'll go into education because that will give me a chance to go out every summer and practice Zen. So I stayed home. And at that time, met my future wife, Maureen, and she was a lifelong Catholic. And I met Maureen, and I met her I was at a potluck dinner talking about my experience at a Zen center. And she had come to this potluck because she just moved into the city, and a friend of hers wanted to go, and she was interested in just the whole community of people that was there. It wasn't a Zen community. It was just people practicing a particular vegetarian diet. And I met her, and she was Catholic, and we had a very rapid courtship. But during that courtship, I met some very inspiring people that were Catholic. And that was really a key turning point for me. When I left the Zen Center, I left behind a community of people. I left behind a ritual that I really enjoyed. And I left behind a strong spiritual leader. And I recognized that those three things were things that I missed. I want a community. I want someone to guide me. And I didn't realize I missed the ritual, but it was very ritualistic at the Zen Center. And my wife, Maureen, my future wife, was working at the Little Sisters of the Poor nursing home. And I went there from time to time as we were dating. And one of the sisters there, Sister Clara McDonough, was the first person of prayer I'd ever met. She was truly a contemplative, prayerful person. And right away, that spoke to me. Like, I want to know you. I want to be with you. I want to spend time with you because you have something that's very appealing to me. Growing up, we weren't people of prayer, and I didn't really meet people of prayer. We didn't pray. And then I would start attending Mass with Maureen, and I was drawn to the ritual, especially daily Mass. I loved the quiet of the daily Mass. I just liked knowing what was happening, and I started wanting to meet other priests. And then I met a priest, a Franciscan priest, Father Eric Kahn, who has since passed away. And there was something about him that was very contemplative and very prayerful. I also met one other priest, Father Grodi. We were doing our marriage preparation. We would drive to Maureen's home parish. And Father Grodi was very dear to her from in college in Muncie, Indiana. And he was also a very quiet, contemplative, but very thoughtful and prayerful man. So there was something about that, that ethos of prayer within those people that spoke to me, and I want to be with you. And I just started being attracted to these people, and that was what drove me to contact with the Catholic Church. I didn't know the first thing about Christianity. That was one of your first questions this evening. I didn't know that there was a difference between a Unitarian, Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic Church. I thought they were all the same. And I figured you just went to the closest church. And my wife will laugh when I tell you this story. So she went to Mass, and I said, I'm going to go with you to Mass. It was a daily Mass, first time I'd ever set foot probably in a church. That's how ignorant I was, how removed I was from Christianity. And we went to the church, and I said, whatever you do, I'm going to do. You stand up, I'll stand up. You kneel, I'll kneel. I said this to myself. So at one point during the Mass, my wife got up and walked up the aisle to the priest at the front of the church. I said, okay, well, I'll follow you. And she put out her hands. I said, okay, well, I guess that's what I do. And so do you know what happened, right? I received Eucharist, not knowing anything. You know, I just said thank you and came back and sat down. But I'm telling you that story to tell you the degree of my ignorance. I knew so little about Christianity, but I was so drawn to these people.
And it's kind of amazing. So many of us take it for granted. It's hard for us to imagine someone in our culture, in our world, having that kind of ignorance. But it happens, is what you're saying.
I was very sheltered. I went to a large public high school, very diverse, all kinds of races, economics, religions. I dated a Christian girl for a couple of years in high school. But my whole culture within my family and my friends was just Jewish. And I think there was that fear of Christianity. When I was in high school as a Jewish boy, I still was going to religious school once a week. They had us read a book called The Passover Plot. Are you familiar with this book?
Yeah.
In that book, the author claims that Jesus orchestrated the trickery of looking like he was dead and therefore looking like he was coming back to life by receiving some drugs on the cross. And this is what they gave us to read, which is really horrid. It's really disrespectful of Christianity. That's the kind of information I was being fed. And I thought, that's curious. I didn't believe it, but I didn't know enough to say, you shouldn't be giving us this information to read. It's so disrespectful of Christianity. One other thing I do remember growing up is thinking, how could all of these billions of people for 2,000 years believe in this Jesus and all of them been wrong? That question really kind of came back from time to time with me. So I was driving around Christmas Eve, looking at the lights, wondering something special is happening. All these people believe in Jesus. Who are you? Yet I was also having this push away from Jesus through the culture I was growing up in. Without it ever being explicitly said, it was sort of a tacit understanding. We don't go there. And that's why I think I was so ignorant.
You know, I recently heard somebody in a talk say that the most rational thing, if you believe in the reality of God, the most rational thing is prayer. If you think about it, if you really, really, really believe there's a God, then prayer makes all the sense in the world, which is what was drawing you to the church, right? I mean, it was the life of prayer.
It was drawing me all the time. As a boy in Sunday school, religious school, I think that's the Hebrew. And I think that means, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. That's one of the Psalms. Like, those things stuck with me. There was something about that was appealing to me. I may completely have the wrong Hebrew connected to the English, but I'm just giving you this sense of like, I was drawn to that without having any direction whatsoever.
But you and your wife were in the process of getting married. Was the priest saying, now you got to promise to bring up those kids Catholic? Were you being challenged during the wedding itself, the preparation?
I wasn't. I think I knew that we had to do that. And I told my wife, I want to marry you, I love you, but I'm not going to become a Christian. You know, that was where I was. I don't think there was RCIA at that time. That was 1984 when I came into the church. But what I did start doing was I started meeting with Father Eric. I wanted to learn more about this. And he very wisely told me to read St. John of the Cross, which is probably an unusual way for a person to be oriented into the Catholic Church or the Christian faith. But he knew that I'd come from an Eastern mystical orientation. And when I started reading these mystics, St. John of the Cross, I read The Cloud of Unknowing, I read Teresa of Avila, and then I started reading Thomas Merton. They were compelling to me because everything they said was like, yes, this is true. Until one day I was on a solo camping trip in the Smoky Mountains reading Thomas Merton's Seeds of Contemplation. I was sitting up in a fire tower surrounded by fog. And I was reading this book thinking, everything you say, I agree with. I'm just not sure about this Jesus and Mary. Those are the two things I'm not sure about, but your whole orientation towards God, because I never rejected God. These are things, so there's something here. You know, I want to know more about this. And I started talking to Father Eric about this, and he just kept encouraging me to read and to pray. And then, I'm not sure the chronology, but I read the Gospels. I'd never opened the Gospel before. I can remember one week, every night I came home, I sequestered myself in a room in our apartment, shut the door, and read the 4 Gospels. And that was a very awesome experience. It's like, wow, I'm part of the gospel that says we've never seen anything like this before. We've never met anyone like this before. No one talks like this man. That was my experience. Yeah. I just believed it. All the miracles, the teachings and the signs then I felt like, this is Jesus. I'd never really met you before. And it was a very powerful experience. So that kind of pushed me. So like now I want to know more, go into Christianity. And I started answering these questions. Who is this Jesus? Who is this Mary? From reading the Gospels. Yeah.
I think there's a good place to take a break. Dan, I just happened to be reading in the Catechism this morning, in the 400, beginning of that, where it's talking about the creed. And I just remember one statement there where it says that it's the grace of the Holy Spirit and being drawn by the Father through which we come to believe in the Son. It's through the grace of the Holy Spirit being drawn by the Father that we come to believe in that's what you're just witnessing.
Yeah,
to.
That's a really good description of my experience.
It's the grace of the Holy Spirit, putting that hunger in there. But there's also that drawing of the Father to the Son. That's the Catechism, which encourages us. That's in a section encouraging us to catechize so that people can feed that hunger within them. We'll pause, Dan. Come back just a moment with more of Dan Teller's story. See you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Dan Teller. And we've paused you right in that place in your process where you've read the Gospels.
Yes.
Right? You've read the Gospels.
Yes.
And there's this question, does Jesus and Mary?
Well, Marcus, you were saying that we're drawn, the work of the Holy Spirit draws us to the Father, to Jesus. Yeah. And that really describes my experience. So I started thinking, I accepted pretty much everything that I was encountering in the church, going to Mass, reading the Gospels. The one thing that was hard for me is to accept Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking I'd like to be baptized. And Father Eric, there was no RCIA at that time for me. I was working just with this priest. And I remember saying to Father Eric, I can say these baptismal promises, but when it comes to do you believe in Jesus Christ, it's going to be hard. That's hard for me to say. I don't want to say no, but I want you to know I'm still struggling with that.
What was hard about it specifically? I mean, you believed it. Did you believe he was a historic person?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I think it was just overcoming a lifetime, as I said at the beginning, of we don't go there. Okay. That's a hurdle. Yeah. That's an area where we just stay away from that, from Jesus. Yeah. but I was attracted to the person of Jesus, through the Gospels. And so I think he must have recognized that was he just said, just keep moving forward. That's okay. You just keep on. And I actually have a couple sons that are one son is a priest now, and then the second son is in formation for the priesthood. You're going to be ordained in a month.
Wow.
And I shared that with them, and they said, he gave you a good answer. So I was glad to hear that just keep pushing forward. And so I said, yes, I'll be baptized. I'd like to become Catholic. And it was a very small ceremony, just my wife and my wife's parents. And I didn't really tell anyone else about it. And I was initiated into the church through the mystics and through prayer and through reading the Gospels. I didn't know much about Catholic dogma. I wasn't taught about the sacraments explicitly. And so my education really was just starting to begin, I just didn't know much about Catholicism. My introduction into Catholic teaching came through reading church documents. So I opened some of the documents of Vatican II, and I remember reading one of them, maybe it was Lumen Gentium. And I thought to myself, I have not read something this intelligent, this clearly expressed, this sensitive ever. I was so touched by the depth of the writing of that document and its clarity that I wanted to read more. And so that was 1984 that I came into the church. And at that time, Pope John Paul was Pope. And so I decided to start reading some of the things that he had written. And my wife teases me because she said at night I'd be sitting with a John Paul encyclical and she's reading her murder mystery next to me in bed. And I can't claim to understand everything John Paul has written because he's so profound and deep and philosophical. But I was really attracted by his words. So reading through these documents and reading through Pope John Paul, I started to understand some of the teachings of the church. And I would start reading biblical commentaries. And then I started reading lots of the saints. St. Augustine, St. Athanasius, St. Francis de Sales. I just couldn't get enough of reading some of these works. And they just kept drawing me in a more joyful and deep way into the heart of the church. I've just kept discovering more and more. So I was just drawn to this. And that became my education in Catholicism at that time. I guess you could say I was self-educated.
Okay. As you look back, I'm assuming here we are today that you believe in Jesus.
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay.
With no qualms, wholeheartedly.
I'm wondering if you look back, and it may be hard to put a time or an issue or an event, but can you look back to a time when the aha, what was it that got you to recognize, who he is, Son of God, that he has given his life for us on the cross, that, all of that you saw that this was real?
I don't know if I can tell you one aha moment, but I can tell you one profound moment for me was my first Easter Vigil. And when I went, and I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know there was going to be a bonfire outside. I didn't know it would be dark in the church. I didn't know the Exultet would be chanted. But when I heard that Exultet being chanted, I felt like I'm drawn into this mystery. This mystery is good. It is true. I am just in love of being a part of it. Similarly, my first midnight mass, when I heard that whole chant at the beginning of the history of time and how Jesus inserts himself in time, that was a really impactful moment. And a final impactful moment for me wasn't just one moment, but was going down to visit the monks at Gethsemane, because I love Thomas Merton, and I realized, his monastery isn't far from where I live. I'm going to go visit. And when I went into that chapel, the church, and saw the monks chanting, I was just brought right into that. And I became friends with the chaplain there, Father Matthew Kelty, at that time, who was a very wonderful monk, and he was the chaplain. All those things, I was so at ease that, of course, Jesus is who he says he is. I don't remember an aha moment. I just remember feeling like this is unquestioned.
You also mentioned Our Lady was a bit of a hurdle.
Yes. But once I accepted Jesus and accepted the church, I had no problem addressing Mary. I've heard about other conversion stories from people, especially coming from Protestantism into Catholicism, dealing with the primacy of Mary that the church gives to Mary, not primacy over Christ, of course, but an esteemed role. And also, or papal infallibility, none of those things bothered me at all. I just didn't question them one bit. So I would say with Mary, I never questioned her as the mother of God. It was just the idea of developing a relationship with Mary is something that just took time. You know, my wife loves the rosary. And so over time, I would start to pray the rosary more and more. And of course, reading was always important to me. Reading like St. Louis de Montfort was helpful for me to hear about Mary. But also things like chanting the Salve at the end of Compline. That is those prayer experiences, I think, just drew me in. Like I love chanting the Salve in the dark to Our Lady. So it was easy.
Talk about the apostolates that you're involved with, how they developed after your journey. You're the founder and catechist of the Good Shepherd Catholic Montessori School.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
But then also trustee of the Angelical Project. So how do those connect with your journey, if you will?
As I was courting my wife and becoming drawn towards the church, I was also being trained as a Montessori teacher. And I got my first job at a public Montessori school in Cincinnati as a teacher and loved it, loved Montessori. Over the course of those 10 years I was there, that's when I was becoming oriented to the teachings of the church as well through my reading and realizing I don't want to be separated in my career from the secular and the sacred world. I'd like those to be combined. I'd like to work as a Catholic educator. And so I was able to get a job as a principal at a parish school. And it was at that time that I realized Montessori is the best way to educate a child. Although we were homeschooling our children, so I felt like that's a wonderful way to educate a child too. That was what was right for our family. But my career was as a Montessori educator. And I realized I want to be in the Catholic Church teaching and working as an educator. I don't want the life of faith to be separated because you can't educate the whole child without the spiritual realm being addressed. But I wanted to do it in a Montessori pedagogy because I feel like Montessori is right at the heart of the church because she gives an incredible respect to the dignity of the human person. The respect given to children through Montessori education is unparalleled. And it's really touches on Catholicism. So I decided I need to be able to put these two together, and I didn't know how. So I'd like to have a Catholic Montessori school that I'm a part of. And so that's how that apostolate began, through that desire to be Montessori educator and a Catholic educator together. And in putting those two together, I found out about something called the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. Are you familiar with that? The Catechesis of the Good Shepherd is a Montessori-based form of Catholic formation for children. It's actually used in a number of denominations, but it was formed in the Catholic Church, but has now been embraced by other denominations. But it's right at the heart of the Catholic Church as well. The Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, it's based on liturgy, scripture, and prayer, and finally an understanding of the spiritual nature of the child at every age. So when I learned about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, realized this is how you create a Catholic Montessori school, by having a Montessori program with this form of catechesis embedded within it. And so then I did a lot of work to create the school, and we started.
You know, thinking about your own journey, when we were talking about this God-planted hunger within every person, that whether they understand it or recognize it, it's a part of us. It's part of our conscience, right?
Yes.
So if you have an education that doesn't recognize that, then there's no effort to try and answer that hunger in a secular environment.
No.
It's going to get answered.
Yes, isn't it?
It's going to get answered, which is the craziness that we're in our world right now. It's going to get answered one way or the other. That's why, as you're saying, bringing those two together and having a Catholic environment to make sure every child has that hunger. So we have to make sure we address it as they grow up. And that's what you're talking about.
Well, as we said, the heart's restless.
Yep.
It has to settle somewhere. Children have a total innate openness to the presence of God. They want to enjoy God's presence, and they're able to, especially when they're very, very young. So we don't have to create this. We just have to respond to that need of the child by giving them the fullness and the beauty and the joy of a life of faith.
Yeah. All through the Old Testament, God was telling Moses and Aaron to tell the parents, to tell the kids about what they had gone through so that they could live according when they're young.
Yes.
When they're young. If we miss that time, it's hard later on.
The foundress of our form of catechesis, her name is Sophia Cavalletti, has said that moral formation is rooted in the youngest plane of development, from birth to 6, before a child develops morality. They aren't thinking yet about what's fair or unfair, what are the rules, but they're thinking about who is God and how do I encounter him? Not thinking about it, but they're having an opportunity. When a child can encounter God at a foundational enjoyment level, the moral life is well-founded, because you don't want to be away from someone you love. It makes so much sense.
We have an email. Sasha from Albany writes, what are some of your impressions of Catholic monasticism compared to some of the other forms of monasticism that you explored in your spiritual search?
Oh, well, I loved the monks at Gethsemane. I loved the schedule that they kept. It was very similar, you might say. There was prayer, there was work, there was silence, and occasionally there was recreation. There was the chanting of the Psalms at Gethsemane and the liturgy. At the Zen Center, there we had chanting, and we had just the silence of meditation. So there's a strong similarity in the monastic life. The difference, of course, is the orientation that we're oriented to, the truth and goodness and beauty of who is God, and that great attractiveness and invitation of coming close to him through the monastic life of the Catholic faith. I don't know if that responds to that question well or not.
Again, there's a desire and an expectation of an authentic connection with the vertical reality of our Creator, who loves us and is all that is. And so many of these other things are trying to duplicate the process without the content.
We've got it all right here in the church. I love the Liturgy of the Hours. I fell in love with that at Gethsemane, and I pray it every single day. I love the Psalms. I just, all of it just lifts us up into the beauty of prayer. The church has all those ways to go.
This is an analogy, but I don't know if I've said this on the program before, but the whole other subject, but it kind of reminds me of this, is that, I live on a farm. My wife, Marilyn, and I live on a farm, and we don't actively involve with the farming anymore, or very much, but there's a lot of people in our world today, because of what's happening in the world. They want to go back to the land, sustainable farming, and self-sufficient farming. And there are whole movements, I don't want to name any of them, that are all about being self-sufficient. And in other words, they want to be self-sufficient like our great-grandparents were. They want to have their kind of life. But the problem is they want to have their kind of life without their faith.
Yes.
That which fed our great-grandparents was their commitment to Christ. That was underlying their self-sufficiency. But the people want the process today without the content that was there.
You just have to hope that someone's heart wants to get to the very end of things, to the very, or that you say the height of things. There's no end. Yeah. The height of the beauty of God is what we must yearn for.
Another email. James from Peoria. I'm interested in reading some of the writings of Catholic mystics and contemplatives, but I find them a bit intimidating. How do you get started when you began to look into these traditions of Catholic prayer? I mean, you were kind of set for it because of your background.
Yes.
But how do you help someone that doesn't have that?
Maybe a shorter work. The Cloud of Unknowing was a shorter work. Thomas Merton is very accessible. His Seeds of Contemplation was one thing I enjoyed. I know that Thomas Merton kind of strayed into Eastern thought, which at that time probably attracted me as well. But I think that some of those works, he has a work on contemplative prayer that's really very beautiful. And I think those things are an accessible way to bridge that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to mention here is that Dan Burke's group, Spiritual Direction, which is a connection with EWTN, has a lot of introductions into this for that folk that want to get introduced into the spirituality many Catholic writers. I mean, it's a simple way to kind
Yeah, I read
of stick your toe in.
I read an 80-page book recently about the prayer of St. Teresa of Avila, her road to contemplative prayer. It wasn't by her, with many excerpts from her. I don't remember its title. So that was the prayer of St. Teresa of Avila, perhaps, something like that.
Yeah, you know, many non-Catholic Christians could almost think they've never read anything by a Catholic. But what's fascinating is that the most read, it was once reported that one of the most read books outside of the Bible itself amongst non-Catholic Christians is a book called The Imitation of Christ.
Yes.
By Thomas à Kempis. I mean, there's a monastic reflection on how to imitate Jesus in your life. What a great classic.
Yes. Our pastor and one of the popes said they would read that every night, you know, before going to bed. Our pastor said that. I know a pope had said that.
Also, you mentioned the Angelica Project.
The Angelica Project is a wonderful project. It's relatively new. It's to evangelize culture through goodness, truth, and beauty, through the arts, thought, and culture. We're getting it off the ground right now in Cincinnati. And we have seasons. We try to put together performances, lectures, and workshops. Like just this coming weekend is a workshop on photography. Just this past weekend, we had a hike outside with the poets to get outside during the time of COVID. And we read poetry. We did a hike outside with the Psalms in the fall, where we prayed the Psalms on a hike. We had a movie by Rob Orlando about the relationship between Pope John Paul and Ronald Reagan. We had a talk by Leah Labresco and about the Benedict option. So we're trying to, in a whole variety of ways, orient people towards the goodness, truth, and beauty that we all seek through the arts. So we're trying to get that started in Cincinnati right now.
And whenever I hear about apostles like yours that are focusing on beauty and the arts, and I think of that as one of many arrows in a quiver, because we're all drawn by different things. You know, some people are really drawn by the arts, some people aren't. Maybe they might be drawn by the didactic arguments as opposed to arts. But it's an arrow in the quiver that God uses.
We actually feel like everyone in some way is attracted to the goodness, truth, and beauty that were expressed by some art form, and that is a beautiful entryway into looking towards the goodness, truth, and beauty you ultimately find in the church. One of my wife's favorite things to say is like, I have lots of friends that are secular and very liberal in their thinks and non-religious. They would not come to a talk at our parish because they would think, no, I don't go there. But if I can invite them to a talk somewhere else or a concert somewhere else that's not explicitly Catholic, that's the doorway to start to see the goodness and truth and beauty that will simply keep intensifying and growing as you explore it.
Yeah, a book I know I've mentioned many times on the program is a classic book by Bonaventure called Journey of the Mind to God. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that.
I have not.
But in that book, he talks about how to grow in relationship to God. And he begins by recognizing in nature the vestiges of God there. Mm-hmm. I mean, that connects with what you're talking about. There are people that can look and see the beauty and all that, but do you see that right there is a fingerprint of God?
We just last week on our walk with the poets read a beautiful poem about a heron rising out of the thick dark waters of the pond. And the poet Mary Oliver, who's not explicitly religious as far as I know, said, how can you doubt the idea of the ascension when you see this bird rising? You know, that image from nature speaks to the transcendent.
And our Lord said that. Look at the birds, look at the flowers. Well,
yes.
When you see them, he's drawing our attention back to something that is very stable and is also a reflection of God's creative act. It's his love. We're seeing it right
He
there.
manifests himself for us in the world.
We have another email, Celeste from Knoxville. I have many friends who have no interest in the Catholic faith because of their distaste for religion. A lot of them consider themselves spiritual people, but when I press them what they mean by that, I get really vague explanations. Why do you think so many people gravitate towards vague spirituality and reject the idea of religion?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question for a scholar greater than me. I think that we're in this soup of our culture, and as we know that now recently we've learned that less than half our country is even going to church. So unless you're in contact with something good and now we have the whole culture pushing against it and saying how bad it is. Why would people want to explore it? For me, it was these contact with these beautiful people. It was like St. Francis said, always preach the gospel. If you need to, use words. That was my experience, just these beautiful people drawing me into, there's something you have that I want. So for this woman asking this question, maybe it's the goodness and beauty and love that she emanates, that Christ is shining through her. As she was saying in the email, words aren't going to do it at first with these people.
Yeah, again, back to whenever you see the news and you see the craziness that's happening, we recognize every single one of those people had within their conscience a hunger for God. And that wasn't fed.
No.
That wasn't fed. And so how do we reach that? Well, that's evangelization. There's all kinds of ways to reach out people. Of course, it really begins, as you were saying, though, what were the three things that you missed when you left that community?
Community, ritual, and a spiritual guide.
You know, that's what a lot of people are lacking, is a community that will help them in feeding that actual thing, as opposed to a community that's feeding them in the wrong direction and guides that are taking them in the wrong direction.
I have found that at our school. People come to our school for many reasons. Some because they love the Catholic identity of the school, some because they love Catholic catechesis, but some because they just want a good Montessori program in a safe setting. Those people are pulled into something different than what they expected, if they're open to it. But we've had adults come into the church because their children fell in love with God and fell in love with Jesus. So there's lots of ways to get there.
Maybe one last email. Adrian from New Mexico. I'm fascinated by the continuity between Judaism and Catholicism. What were some of the most interesting connections you found between Catholicism and the Jewish faith you were raised with?
I learned these connections through the Sophia Cavaletti, the formator of the Catechesis, the Good Shepherd. Probably the most interesting thing I've learned is the concept of memorial. That at the Seder meal, we're not just remembering something happened long ago. We say, we were slaves in Egypt. The Lord led us out of slavery. We're reliving that moment in time, that biblical moment. We have our own slavery we need to be led out of. That's no different than going to Mass, where we stand right at the foot of the cross. We experience the glory of the resurrection, and we encounter the Christ who's to come again in glory. All of that timelessness is present in the liturgy. It's rooted in the Jewish liturgy, and it's filled in the Christian Catholic liturgy as well. That was the most interesting thing.
You know, I could ask you this about someone with a Jewish background, but I'm also interested to ask you this final question about somebody who's caught up in mysticism, New Age mysticism. Let's say a person just happens to be watching right now from that. How do you get them to come towards the Christian faith when they're absorbed in that lifestyle? What would you say to them to draw them to make the same journey you've made?
Well, I think it's the Holy Spirit sent from the Father working towards Jesus. I just think that instead of just sitting silently, vacuously in meditation, read something from the gospel first. Read about a moment in the life of Christ and then think about it. And then let it just sort of seep into you for a while until you're more in silence. That's how I practice my silent prayer. I start by thinking about Christ, an event in his life, and if that just kind of goes away, I don't mind sitting quietly for a while, or just repeat the name of Jesus. Jesus, I trust in you. That's a big prayer of mine over and over again. I guess you just have to let the Holy Spirit work in each person in their own unique way, but just open yourself to the gospel and to Jesus speaking to you in your heart in that silence.
You know, trying to think about how to encourage somebody to turn that kind of mystical prayer into a more vertical connection with God. It reminds me of a scripture in Philippians 4 that says, have no anxiety about anything, but in everything, make your request known to God. And it talks about with prayer and petition with thanksgiving. So in other words, if you can have an attitude of gratitude,
yes,
think about how much God has given into your life as the foundation for your prayer. That starts bringing in that vertical gratitude as the foundation for that spiritual life.
You said, talking about nature, how can you look at the beauty of these dogwood and redwood trees and the glorious green of the spring without thinking it came from someone? It's there, it's everywhere. We're swimming in it. We just have to enjoy and appreciate it and acknowledge the Creator that gave this to us. It doesn't just happen, it didn't all happen on its own.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, maybe it needs someone like you as a friend to point that out so that God can start using that in their life.
Or to encounter someone that just naturally says, thank you, God. I love this beauty. Thank you for giving it. Just naturally, just to say it.
Dan, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Joining us on the program, sharing your own journey, and we ask God's blessings on the work that you're doing in your teaching and in your new project. And all of you, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Dan's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.